Good afternoon and welcome to our annual tea, membership meeting, and season opening program. My name is Dina Hirsch, Vice President of the Generations After. Before we begin what promises to be a fascinating and enlightening program on rebuilding lives from DP camps to the US and Israel, I'd like to share a short report on the accomplishments and challenges that defined the Generations After this past year. At last year's membership meeting, our president, Beth Cohen, said, "This has been another challenging year for all of us. Despite the isolation, the losses, the lack of in-person connections, we have continued to offer programs, virtual gatherings, educational projects, as well as financial support to organizations that aid our cherished survivors. Our multi-generational family continues to foster the legacy and memory of those impacted by the Shoah. With the COVID scenario still so uncertain, we hesitate to schedule any in-person gatherings until the picture becomes clearer. And while I wish we could all share a cup of tea together in person today, in the immortal Tevia's words, we'll have to wait a little longer." Now let's look at some of our accomplishments from 2020-2021. Our very active programs committee has brought us several educational and inspiring programs so far this year. In February, we held a program with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's National Institute for Holocaust Documentation, highlighting its efforts to collect, preserve, and make accessible its vast and invaluable collection of Holocaust records. Their work is key to supporting the museum's goals. Participants also learned about the services available for conducting family history research by museum staff, and many took advantage of this wonderful opportunity. Our July program featured a screening of the film Winter Journey, based on 2G Martin Goldsmith's book, The Inextinguishable Symphony. This was followed by a fascinating discussion with Martin and the film's Danish director, Anders Ostergaard, moderated by NPR's Bob Edwards. On November 7th, we will bring you a special program commemorating Kristallnacht. Attention to this crucial event in Holocaust history has waned in recent years, but we feel it is important to continue to remember the significance and horror of that pogrom. Our event will feature stories, poems, videos, and most importantly, survivor testimony. Our popular book group turned 10 years old this year, and our members have read and discussed over 50 books related to the Holocaust. During the pandemic, our meetings have increased in size, with between 12 and 35 members zooming in from different parts of the country. Our next meeting is scheduled for September 26th. We now have 2 writing groups with a total of 15 members. We are working on an anthology of some of our writings with the goal of publishing and sharing these riveting 2G stories. We are pleased to have recruited a talented editorial board to help with the process. Our Remember a Child program continues to match B'nai Mitzvah students with children who were murdered in the Holocaust. Last year, even with many B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies delayed, we were able to honor the cherished memories of 24 children. Among those participating in the program was a group of adult B'nai Mitzvah from Florida. This summer, we began organizing a speakers bureau with 10 Gen After members. To prepare for future speaking opportunities, we plan to hold a training workshop in the fall. We are blessed to have several experienced 2G trainers who will conduct the workshop. Financially, our organization is on sound financial footing. Due to a very generous anonymous gift to our organization, we were able to double our annual gift to Blue Card to $5,000 this year. This outstanding New York City-based survivor support organization offers financial assistance in the form of direct aid to thousands of needy survivors throughout the US. According to their website, they are currently assisting 3,000 survivor households in 35 states. These activities are funded largely by your membership dues. We thank all of you who became members of the organization or renewed in the past year. For those of you who have not, please do so on our website. You can pay via PayPal or by check. Now I am pleased to introduce Rachel Miller, member of our program committee, who will introduce this afternoon's program.
In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe was approximately 9.5 million. When the war ended in May 1945, 2 of every 3 European Jews had perished, 6 million dead. And those who survived, the walking dead who were liberated from the concentration camps, those who had been in hiding, the ones who masqueraded as Christians with false papers, the partisans, what were they to do? Go back to the communities that had betrayed them, search for relatives and friends who may or may not have survived. How were they to exist in this new reality and where? Today's discussion will tackle these and other questions as we investigate the topic, Rebuilding Lives from DP Camps to the US and Israel. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of historians and a renowned psychiatrist to help us understand the dynamics of this post-war period. A link to their bios is on the screen. Our moderator for this afternoon's program is Dr. Ira Brenner, clinical professor of psychiatry at Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and training and supervising analyst at the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia. He has a special interest in the area of psychological trauma and chairs the Holocaust discussion group of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Dr. Brenner has authored over 100 publications, as well as 6 books, including The Last Witness, the child survivor of the Holocaust. His numerous awards include the Gratz Research Prize for his work on the Holocaust and the Heyman Award for Holocaust Studies from the International Psychoanalytic Association. While Dr. Brenner and our other distinguished panelists, Dr. Beth B. Cohen and Dr. Dalia Ofer, are discussing today's topic, please be sure to submit any questions you have in the chat for our Q&A session. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Ira Brenner.
Thank you, Rachel, for that kind introduction. And thank you, members of the Generations After, for allowing me to participate in this very important and meaningful program. Beth Cohen began her career in Holocaust studies as director of the Rhode Island Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 1998, she left the museum to attend the inaugural PhD program at Clark University, the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the first U.S. university to grant a PhD in Holocaust history. While a postdoc student at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, she wrote the important book, Case Closed: Holocaust Survivors in Post-War America, an analysis of the reception of survivors by the American Jewish community. Her second book, Child Survivors of the Holocaust, focuses on experiences of the youngest DP camp internees who came to the US after the war. She has also contributed and consulted to numerous edited book collections, documentary films, and educational projects. Dr. Cohen teaches at several California universities and is currently researching the question of post-war grief and mourning in survivors. Dr. Dalia Ofer is the Max and Rita Haber Professor of Holocaust and East European Studies at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Emerita. In 2018, she received the Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies from the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University. She's been a visiting professor at Harvard, Yale, Brandeis, the University of Maryland, and the University of Sydney, Australia, among other notable institutions. Dr. Ofer has published extensively on the Holocaust, Holocaust memory, and immigration to Israel. Several of the books she has authored or edited relate directly to today's topic. Most notably, Escaping the Holocaust, Illegal Immigration to the Land of Israel, Holocaust Survivors, Resettlement, Memory, Identities, and Starting Anew, the Rehabilitation of Child Survivors, the Holocaust in the Early Post-War Period. Now that we've met our very notable panelists, let's begin with you, Beth.
Just a few words of context. Many of you are all now familiar with this iconic picture from the Landsberg DP camp, brimming with the promise of new beginnings that symbolize survivors' return to life, evident in the historically high birth rate in the DP camps at the time. I'm sure some of you in the audience are among those. I'm using that as a starting point simply to say that this post-war story, of course, began in Europe in 1945 as survivors start to contemplate their future, where to go, how to get there. I emphasize that this is a fraught, complicated, and far from monolithic story. Still, there are patterns that emerge from studying hundreds of individuals that paint an overall picture of the relationship between survivors and American Jews and its role in survivors rebuilding their lives. For those considering the United States, the doors were firmly closed. But in December 1945, President Truman issued a directive that allowed 28,000 Jewish immigrants to enter the United States. The 1948 DP Act, Displaced Persons Act, pushed the door open a bit further. Eventually, by 1954, some 140,000 refugees had settled in the United States. These 140,000 were mainly between the ages of 20 and 40. The average age was 29. A grim reminder that few young children or elderly people had survived. Records suggest, too, that slightly more men than women were among the survivors. Statistics also indicate that the largest demographic arriving were single individuals, followed closely by groups of 3 people. For context, the US population at the time was 141 million, and the Jewish population was around 5 million, and more than half lived in the New York City area. The Truman Directive granted Jewish organizations the ability to sponsor survivors, guaranteeing that a newcomer would not become a public charge. Jewish leaders immediately created a national agency in 1946 to coordinate the refugee resettlement program. And this agency was called the United Service for New Americans, or USNA. It was a huge agency and at its peak, second in size only to the American Red Cross. In 1946, May of 1946, the first survivors began to arrive. Articles soon appeared regularly. Here, I'm going to show you. Here we go. Here's one with an article from the New York Times and pictures showing people arriving and being welcomed. Here are a couple of orphans. Orphans were a very popular topic at the time, and it's a topic in its own right. So it's one that I'm not going to talk about in my remarks, that can be taken up in the Q&A. These kinds of images were popular, and they were picked up by the wire and appeared in newspapers all across the country. One of USNA's goals was to resettle the refugees it sponsored away from New York in Jewish communities around the United States. USNA worked diligently with cities and towns, asking them to accept quotas of new immigrants. In general, it was a struggle. Still, Jewish communities in almost every state sponsored new immigrants, which in combination with relative sponsors is why survivors ended up in far-flung places. And here's a map. I apologize for the quality, but it shows you how where the distribution is. The light states are where there were less than 250 people. The diagonal states like Florida and Georgia, surprisingly, were 250. to 500 people. Places like Colorado and Wisconsin had 500 to 1,000 people, larger, and there were larger numbers in the Eastern Seaboard. New York, of course, was the largest with over 5,000 at the time. This was an early map in 1949. But as a result of so many survivors staying in New York, a new agency was created, the New York Association for Nyanas, New York Association for New Americans, NYANA, which was created to help the more than 60% of survivors who stayed in New York. So this provides a bit of context about the mechanics of resettlement. But what about the more subtle and elusive aspects of survivors' experiences? What were the quality of the encounters between the immigrants and American Jewry committed, on paper at least, to assisting them? In order to capture authentic experiences during this time, I draw from several hundred case files written by social workers who reported on their meetings with survivors from 1946 to 1954. Unmediated by time, they provide a window into the first face-to-face interactions between American Jews and the newcomers. These documents record a time in survivors' lives that was raw and emotional, a stark reminder that survivors, having endured the Shoah and its resulting losses, now had to confront the demands of rebuilding their lives in a harsh and unfamiliar terrain. Whether a survivor was sent to Denver or New York, the Jewish Agency's policy was first and foremost invested in the belief that a refugee's path to successful adjustment lay through work and self-support. Most newcomers, too, some 90%, according to a NYANA report, were very eager to find employment. After all, by then people had or were hoping to start families and were eager to settle down. To help achieve this goal, the agencies offered minimal financial help and general counseling, including vocational counseling, of course. During the first year, the case files reveal the challenges and obstacles the newcomers faced. This includes obvious ones: learning a new language, finding housing and work, especially given survivors' outdated job skills, but also anti-immigrant discrimination, anti-Semitism, ageism in the workplace, and sponsors' broken commitments. In addition, the files expose how the after effects of the Shoah, including physical and mental challenges, could undermine even the most ardent wish to settle down. As case files, as well as later oral testimonies show, survivors were clearly in distress. This is reflected in the significant degree of illness, over 60% recorded in the case files. Some were physical ailments such as heart disease or the effects of TB, but many suffered from symptoms for which doctors found no organic basis. One man felt as though he was constantly choking. One woman described her fear of entering subway trains. A widow whose husband and daughter had been murdered details loneliness and ongoing sadness. Her doctor diagnosed depression due to menopause as the root of her difficulties. It's not that professionals ignore the survivors' symptoms, but generally view the problems in relation to survivors' ability to work, continually reminding the newcomers that work was the best medicine. Attitudes towards the newcomers are telling and highlight biases towards the clients that reflect contemporary class and gender differences, as suggested by historian Rebecca Coburn. Records repeatedly show caseworkers reporting with impatience that survivors, quote, felt they deserved special treatment for what they had been through. The use of the words dependent and manipulative repeatedly describes survivors who are struggling and require assistance beyond 1 year or are simply baffled by the American system and need help negotiating it. And the Jewish Agency were not always sympathetic to Judaism. Religious people were routinely offered jobs that required working on Shabbat. Through the lens of these documents, it also appears that American Jewry was disinclined to hear about the Holocaust. When survivors mentioned their murdered relatives, social workers advised, "You're here in America, look ahead." These responses do reflect contemporary ideas of bereavement, but other comments seem unnecessarily cruel. One woman, deeply despondent over her daughter's death, was chided, quote, "Others like you have managed to get over it and move on." And in fact, many did want to and did focus on the future. But just as they endeavored to do so, the recent past was often possible to ignore. Even as unfailingly upbeat articles in the media boasted that the survivors were acclimating quickly, much was hidden from view. And on the left here, you'll see an article from the New York Times. DP's quick to catch tempo of America survey shows new immigrants become self-sustaining in short time and offer few problems. On the right-hand side is a little story from New Neighbors, which was the ESNA publication, and from Flint, Michigan, how community salvages lives is shown in newspaper series. And it highlights one survivor, David Brodowski, who is working at a barber in Flint, Michigan, and his wife is expecting, they're expecting their first child. And the article points out how well they are adjusting. It's not that these accounts are false, but an excerpt from David Brodowski's testimony in 1982 brings into stark relief that finding jobs and learning English, though important, did not keep memory at bay. And you'll see here, part of my screen is, let me move those if I can. Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to read, I won't read the whole quote, you can, but I'll highlight, and we have to live with it. We just live with it. It's just as bad living with it now that almost was in the camps. Sure, you established a family, you established a home and everything else, but whatever happened, we can never forget. It's very, very bad to live without parents, without brothers, without sisters. It's very bad. That's from David's testimony in 1982. His comments resonate with scholar Lawrence Langer's concept of chronological and durational time, which suggests that survivors were existing in parallel realities of past and present simultaneously. In general, survivors found sympathy from neither their caseworkers nor their US families. Over and over, case files reveal a less than hospitable response. For example, a significant number of people turned to the agencies because their relatives reneged on their promises of support. A common pattern is one where relatives showed some initial interest that quickly dissipates. What stands out is that survivors seem bewildered, but willing to accept their relatives' lack of financial support. But when relatives do not see them as part of a family and exclude them from family get-togethers or holidays, as one woman expressed disappointment that she was not invited to a Seder, others mention utter rejection when told by a relative that they want nothing to do with them. That's not to say that there aren't examples of American relatives who are warm and welcoming, but those instances seem to be outweighed by the opposite. Survivors, however, needed community and found it with each other. Wherever they settled, they created groups. The New Texans in the Lone Star State, the New Americans in Boston and Denver, the Newcomer Club in Pittsburgh, the 1939 Club in LA, dozens of others dotted the post-war landscape around the United States. As historian Daniel Sawyer notes, in the largest cities, some breathed new life into existing Landsmannschaften or established new ones. Others found informal venues like annual gatherings in summer bungalows, or even casual card games on weekends or picnics, such as the one captured here in Providence, Rhode Island. For survivors, these early groups were critically important, supporting social networks where they shared a common language of experience, even if their experiences per se differed. Many felt a sense of kinship and celebrated holidays and personal milestones together, as some in the audience listening may recall. In addition, many of these groups were the impetus for early commemorations. The New Americans in Syracuse and the 1939 group in LA, in fact, initiated early Yom HaShoah programs in the 1950s. And Landsmannschaften also created the first memorial Yizkor books of destroyed communities. But these groups had other critical function. They provided space for survivors to talk about their past. Discouraged from bringing up painful topics by their caseworkers, as well as their relatives who never asked, or worse, likened wartime shortages in the US to survivors' experiences, they turned to their own. As one woman told me, we, even the survivors, even me, I wanted to talk about it. And talk she did, but at first it was with other refugees that she spoke. She recalls quote, 5-6 couples, survivors, coming to our house on the Sabbath, having a little lunch. What did we talk about? comparing each other's suffering, telling how it was, talking about how by miracle we survived this selection and that selection. And in a way, I think this was really beneficial to us. We didn't keep it inside. And many, many other survivors told me the same, echoed Nettie's experiences. Finally, I want to return to this picture of the picnic to touch on a significant aspect of survivor families exemplified here, and that was brought up to me recently by a 2G friend here in LA. The photo by Heinz Sandelovsky here pictures his wife, Molly, on the far right, their daughter, Margaret, sitting in the front, and two survivor friends and family members. Heinz and Molly typify survivor marriages according to sociologist William Helmreich, as they married quickly in 1945, started a family, and despite their very different backgrounds, had a long married life together. Margaret, born in Berlin, is named after Heinz's mother, who was murdered in Auschwitz, a Jewish custom that had added weight for survivors. As psychoanalyst Dina Wardy suggests, Margaret was their memorial candle, a child that was their triumph, born after the murder of 1.5 million Jewish children. In her, they saw their reason for surviving. On her, they pinned their hopes for rebuilding Jewish continuity, as well as their sorrow over their murdered family. Margaret loved her parents as fiercely as they loved her. However, the privileged role as both bearer of the past and future was a complicated responsibility. To conclude, as we know, survivors eventually claimed a sacred place among American Jews and made many lasting contributions to the larger community. But their first years in America were fraught, and the help they received from the Jewish community committed to helping them often disappointed. Ever shattered by the Holocaust and confronting inhospitable conditions in the US, survivors nevertheless remarkably pushed forward to rebuild new lives with family and community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That really was a very comprehensive and moving presentation. And I think that you have touched on so many important topics, which overlaps with so many other people's work, including my own, that I'm sure we won't have time to touch on all of them, but I think there's a really fantastic survey. Thank you. Dalia?
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I really appreciate it. And I would like to thank my friend Micheline Amir, who suggested my name, and we know each other for many years. And I would stress that my presentation is in many respects very different from both what Ira was talking about and what Beth was talking about. And the perspective is really an Israeli perspective of the first decade of Israel, which puts together a lot of many issues. So I will start with my presentation. In a fascinating volume, Children of the Book, in Hebrew, ילדים בסדר גמור, I assume that many of you know Hebrew, Biography of a Generation, the first native Israelis born 1948-55, the historian Hannah Yablonka examined the first generation of children born in Israel during those years. These children, she claims, share the experience of living and growing up in a newly created independent state who recognized neither exile nor foreign rule. For them, growing up in a sovereign state was a natural state of affairs. However, Yablonka does not differentiate between children of Holocaust survivors, who comprised a large number of these recently born, and the others whose parents were not survivors. In 1954, 84% of all children aged 0 to 6 were born in Israel, and 54% of immigrants were survivors. According to her, both groups identified totally with the state, while considerate of their families, both groups cast off their burden of the past. A different approach, if you want to see, this is a book of Hannah Yablonka. It's in Hebrew, it's not translated yet to English. A different approach is presented in Esther Peled's volume, Personal Biographies Essays, the daughter of those who were there, the second generation life stories. All of the life stories appearing in this work convey more complex experiences and conflictual feelings. How the protagonist felt that their parents were different and how much they yearned to be like children whose parents were not survivors. These voices express their feelings of difference because of their background and how throughout their childhood and adolescence, they try to erase this difference. In many respects, I think that both scholars are right, and I'll return to this point in my conclusion. To begin with, I will define how I relate to the term Holocaust survivors. Then I will demonstrate their role in the establishment of the state and sustaining it during the first decade. I will discuss their decision to start families and what this meant for them, and I will conclude with a few comments as how the second generation reflect on themselves. The population of survivors in Israel is diverse due to various factors. The first factor is the nature of the war experience. During the Holocaust, there were different paths of survival in hiding in the forests, in camps, assuming false identity, and escaping to the Soviet Union. The majority survived in the Soviet Union under harsh conditions and were repatriated to Poland after the war. From there, many escaped to displaced person camps, particularly to those in the American zone. The second factor to consider is the time of immigration. We have three groups of survivors who came to Palestine, Israel, in different times. The first, survivors who reached Palestine during World War through Yus Aliyah or illegal immigration. By the end of the war, they felt as part of the veterans of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, it's called Yishuv, and participated in the struggle for independence. The second group was survivors who reached Palestine from the time of liberation in Europe to the establishment of the state in May 1948. Many of them did not see themselves as immigrants after being during these years, 45, 46, 47, up to the establishment of the state in the country and joining the struggle for independence. However, the largest number of survivors who arrived in Israel after its establishment during the mass immigration 1948-51, when the population was doubled within 3 years, almost 700,000 immigrants for 650,000 veterans with those Holocaust survivors that I mentioned before, and over half of the immigrants, 350,000 were Holocaust survivors. Many of those, over 50%, aged 15 to 44. 25% were over 45, and only 8.8% were over 60. By the end of 1948, there were 103,000 Holocaust survivors among the 119,000 immigrants in the country, making up of 80% of the immigrants. For the most part, the young men joined the war effort, the War of Independence. During the last month of the War of Independence, September 48 to January 49, 1/4 of all soldiers were Holocaust survivors, serving mostly in combat units. And you should try to imagine, it's important, 1/4 of all Israeli army, and in the combat unit even more, were Holocaust survivors. Those who arrived either in the different stages that I mentioned, but most of them in the last phase. By December 1951, when the first wave of mass immigration ended, Holocaust survivors counted for over half of all immigrants. Some 23% were single. The rest came from families that had been established after the war and had returned from the Soviet Union as part of repatriation. 80% of survivors' families had one child. Males outnumbered females, and the share of unmarried persons among them was smaller than among other immigrants. This demographic characteristic demonstrates the impact of the destruction that occurred. Young people, very few. Middle-aged or older people, single, families with one child. Countries of immigration had preference as to this type of immigrants, young working-age people with a vocation and professional abilities who had a very strong motivation to reconstruct their lives and have children. This brief demographic description allows me to concentrate on the situation in Israel during its first decade regarding families and their contribution to the country's development, families of survivors. Looking at Israel of the late 1950s and early 60s, one finds a diverse ethnic society with different languages, traditions, and culture. It was the beginning of a multicultural society that sought ways to integrate Jews from Islamic countries, Holocaust survivors, and veteran Israelis, and establish a cohesive society. The state pursued a melting pot policy. Holocaust survivors accounted for 1/4 of the Jewish population. Now compare it to the number that Beth said about the US, the number of survivors, and even in comparison to only to the Jewish community of 5 million, and we can understand how the number of survivors in the US were different in the structure and the society than in Israel. Having been a majority of the first wave of mass immigration, they had some advantages over later arrivals, which mean other immigrants from Islamic countries or even from Europe, but who came later. For example, from Poland, what is known as the Gomulka immigration. They were able to settle in the center of the country, in towns and villages from which Palestinians had either fled or had been deported. They were able to get jobs in a market that were created by immigration and by the post-war, War of Independence reconstruction. In many cases, they had relatives who had immigrated before the establishment of the state and enjoyed the advantages of what we call protectia, personal pool and connections. By the end of the war, demobilized soldiers had special privileges on housing, jobs, and other government support. Over 25,000 soldiers were Holocaust survivors, as I mentioned before, 1/4 of the army. Their military service in wartime gave them not only economic advantages, but also a deep sense of belonging. In many respects, it erased feeling of being outsiders. They were already part of the national contract. Moreover, the survivors arrived with organizational experience that they had refined in the DP camps and in their countries of origins in the aftermath of World War II. Applying this experience in Israel, they established bodies such as the Physicians of She'erit HaPleta is the Hebrew expression for the survivors, and the Organization of Disabled of World War II. They were heard in the public sphere and gained support. They gave new meaning to the concept of Landsmannschaft and established new entities of this kind. Apart from expressing their interests and demands, they became the major players in shaping the memory of the Holocaust. By the early 1960s, survivors had also become a meaningful voice in cultural affairs, writing, painting, theater, music, and more. Names like Uri Orlev, Ben-Zion Tomer, Abba Kovner, Aharon Appelfeld were widely known in the field of literature. Ephraim Kishon wrote humoristic and sharp satires in the daily newspaper Ma'ariv, and Elie Wiesel reported for the newspaper Yediot Achronot from Paris, and there were others. Naftali Bezem, Shmuel Beck, Avraham Ofek, and others transformed the Israeli art scene in painting and sculpture, centering on Israeli space that was foreign for them, and using Jewish symbols in their art. They represented their connection to the Holocaust and their Jewishness and Israeli national identity. Survivors were also involved in politics as members of Knesset, the first Knesset, the second Knesset, and party activists. The army was another important field in which survivors contributed immensely after the War of Independence, and they had during it. The survivors' significant role in Israeli life flowed not only from their wish to live and reconstruct their life, but from their determination to become part of the country and shape its reality. Although many were not Zionists in the traditional ideological sense, they were what historian Hagit Lavsky calls intuitive Zionists, who saw Israel as a place that would assure the Jewish collective future. The conventional wisdom about survivors, that they were preoccupied with reconstruction of their personal lives, kept silence about the Holocaust, and wanted to forget past, does not hold water. For most survivors, this separation of past, present, and future was irrelevant because their vision of the state and the society integrated all. They viewed their new life with all its challenges and connected to the development of the state of Israel. Despite their difficulties in integrating the tension of daily life and the many other hardships, they considered Israel as a kind of miracle. And we have this in testimonies in much later years again. I'll turn now to the last theme, the personal perspective, the family, children, and social life. In the first years after the liberation in Europe, the painful memories, the loneliness, the disastrous realization of their family's fate instilled a need and craving for connection and warmth. Men and women established relationships that responded to this immediate need, but not always addressed their deeper emotional concern. The situation in the DP camps encouraged connection by offering reality of togetherness, yet also highlighted the gaping absence of those family and friends who had been murdered. In this immediate post-war period, marriages and birth rate of the survivors in DPs were unprecedented, 35.8 per 1,000. Young men and women who had not experienced motherhood or parenthood or lost their children during the war now had the joy and satisfaction of having a baby who could be named after a dear relative that perished, but also had to face the challenges of parenting with the ensuing responsibilities and many anxieties. Only when a child was born, claimed psychiatrist Hillel Klein, did this couple become a family. After their immigration, these new families faced more challenges. Raising children in Israel during the first years of statehood was difficult. Food was rationed and many commodities were unavailable. After years of hunger, food was primary concern for Holocaust survivors. The ability to improve the food supply was often associated with black market, a phenomenon well known in Israel during that time, yet which was very often too expensive for survivors. Conversely, the open space, the carefree atmosphere of child raising in Israel opened new vistas for parents and children alike. Children strived to adopt the image of the rough but kind sabres, what is the expression for Israeli-born kids. Nevertheless, their parents were ambivalent about this. While happy with their children's activities and adventures, they were also concerned for their safety and suspicious for their conduct. Children experience their parents as different. Although not always able to pinpoint their strangeness, they often developed resentment and even shame of the foreign languages that were spoken at home: Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, and others. Many children of survivors describe how much they wanted to excel and belong in all aspects of Israeli society. They wanted to wear shorts, they had to have the same hairstyles, become members of the youth movement, and participate in all its activities. However, often parents were anxious about the long hiking trips, other activities, such as volunteering to social causes that the movement emphasized, and also the problem of what to wear. Though resisting their parents' authority and being punished by parents who demanded strict discipline, children were also concerned about their parents, worries, and their parents' fears. Often hearing their screams at night, and many are talking about it, and we have it in many places, in literature, in the movies. They wanted to protect their parents. They were often disappointed to find that their parents were not as enthusiastic as they were about the sport activities, their election to student committees, becoming counselors in the youth movement and others. Although their parents identified deeply with the goals of the state and wanted to contribute to society, their understanding of what it meant was often different from that of their children. For the children, the implementation of national goals and values, such as moving to a kibbutz, often clashed with their parents' vision of their future as professionals. A significant issue for the children was how much they knew of their parents' experiences during the war years and their murdered families. Their accounts show that families of parents who spoke about the past and those who maintained silence had similar difficulties. In both cases, the past was like a scary ghost that interfered with their daily life. Whether they knew what had happened or not, the children could hardly understand what had transpired during the Holocaust. It was so far from the reality that they could recognize or imagine. The literature described how these children of different ages endeavored to create a reality that would correspond with their parents' experience. It is represented authentically in works of literature such as Sea Under Love by David Grossman, Why Didn't You Come Before the War by Lizzie Doron, the stories of Savion Liebrecht, and others. To my tentative conclusion, I will go now back to the two books that I mentioned in my opening. Do they contradict each other? The generational biography and the personal perspective of the other book of Esther Peled. For my analysis, the common denominator amongst all youth was their strong identity with the country and the support of social national goals. When looking at the group as a generation and not as individuals, Jablonka's conclusions are clear. Indeed, many of these youngsters grew up to be leaders and elite in all fields of professional endeavors. However, when looking at the individual and the complexity of their feelings and emotions, it is also evident that survivors' children often paid dearly for trying to be children by the book, ילדים בסדר גמור. Only years later, when they had their own children and were able to look at their past with a sense of reconciliation, they were able to express their turbulent feeling and sense of ambivalence as how their parents had impacted their past on their own lives as adults, as parents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dalia. I think that the issue of post-liberation adjustment from a psychological standpoint is of the greatest importance. In my work with traumatized survivors, traumatized child survivors, and adult survivors, this period of time, this period of adjustment or maladjustment has had the greatest implications for future adjustment. As I learned in my interviewing of child survivors with Judith Kestenberg, that the sooner children could get back on track developmentally, the sooner they could enroll in school, the sooner they could assimilate in their new cultures, learn the language, become part of the crowd, to get back on that assembly line of development, the much better off they were. And I think that finding applies to people across the whole life cycle. As Beth was saying, that the emphasis the agencies had was for survivors to get employment, for survivors to help settle down, and do what people in young and early midlife are expected to do in our culture, and that is to partner and work. Basically, the two pillars that Sigmund Freud would talk about, work and love. And I think this applies to the survivors as much as anyone. We know that since the term post-traumatic stress disorder did not come into parlance until the Vietnam War, decades after liberation of the camps, the whole notion of the seriousness of the psychological trauma that Beth alludes to in the survivors was not fully recognized or not able to be recognized because it was so horrendous. Once again, what she says is totally congruent with our findings in interviewing. What Kestenberg had always preached was that when the survivors first got here, many of them couldn't stop talking, and nobody could hear and tolerate what they had to say. We think about this notion of survivor guilt, this irrational and controversial notion in survivors who come back and their family members don't, or their friends don't, and they wonder, why me? Why did I deserve to live? Why did God do this to me? Why did he take somebody much more worthy? But one of the things that I don't think has been focused on nearly as much is the shame and survivor guilt in American Jews. Those people who knew and didn't know what was going on and couldn't help, couldn't do anything. And many of whom had relatives in Europe and had some idea, but just couldn't imagine just how horrible things were. And then when their relatives or they came in contact with survivors after liberation, after they came here, they were mentally unable to listen. It was just too much. By the time I got involved in the Child Survivor Project, which was in the mid-'80s, that's when Kestenberg started this interviewing project. Many of the child survivors, middle age and beyond, and spent a whole lifetime keeping things inside. So to then say, hey, here's this great interviewing project, after a person had spent a whole lifetime keeping things inside because they knew people couldn't hear it. It was just too awful. They couldn't bear to know it themselves. So it was just a very, very challenging thing. Now that so many adult survivors are gone, so many child survivors are leaving us also, the imperative to get their testimonies, for people to leave their legacies, is so very, very important. But the issue of unresolved grief, unresolved mourning, and irrational survivor guilt and shame are very, very pervasive issues. Therapists were completely unprepared. And as we now know from our history of the emigre psychoanalysts from Europe, many of them were traumatized themselves and were in the same kind of shape as their patients or clients. And there was an unwitting collusion of silence to not want to listen. It really wasn't until the 60s and 70s that this whole notion of just what people had endured really came to the fore. Henry Crystal, a Holocaust survivor and prominent psychoanalyst from Michigan, coined the term massive psychic trauma. This is not post-traumatic stress disorder. This is post-traumatic stress disorder on steroids, so to speak. And the losses are incalculable. And I'm very glad that you mentioned Dina Wardy, because her very catchy term, memorial candles, one doesn't have to be a psychologist or spend his or her lifetime immersed in this stuff to get it. That if a child is named for a murdered relative and carries, even if not, the legacy, no matter how much the parent tries to protect the child, is transmitted. So we, second generation people, are memorial candles. I'll just mention parenthetically that in the psychological community, in the psychoanalytic community, there are about 10 different theories about how intergenerational trauma occurs, how the transmission occurs from parent to child, starting with what we now know in our studies of attachment. And the earliest mother-child relationship is very, very important. Dina Wardy talks about memorial candles. Judith Kestenberg, who was a pioneer and my main mentor, talked about this notion of a time tunnel, this transposition, what Beth alluded to about parents living in two time zones. A French analyst by the name of Hedy Feinberg talks about telescoping of generations. My dear colleague, Dory Laub, who's recently deceased, who I've worked with for many, many years at the American Psychoanalytic Association, and our effects of the Holocaust on survivors and their families, talked about an empty circle. And again, something that's missing, memory that's there but dissociated. Elani Kogan talks about a psychic hole. on and on and on. I talk about children having a task in their psychological development to try to integrate the realities of their day-to-day life with the traumatic realities of their parents, because so many of our parents, as you say, were not fully present. They might have been there physically, but were not fully present. Where were they mentally? Wherever they were mentally got transmitted to their children unwittingly and unconsciously. And a big task for us is to try to put all that together and learn from the past so that we can apply it. And that's what the resilience studies are about. Because these days it's not just transmission of trauma. We recognize that there is transmission of resilience, an extremely, extremely important phenomenon. So the issue of adjustment and how people settled in, how they were regarded, and we can just imagine as we look at the nightmare scenes on the news today about what's happening in Kabul, with the evacuations, with the refugees. We know from our Holocaust studies what kind of challenges these people will endure. They may not have specifically experienced genocidal persecution, but so many of them have experienced murder, torture, all kinds of persecution. And when they come to this country or wherever they come, what kind of mixed reception are they going to get? We know. And I think this is where the application of Holocaust studies to today's society is very, very important. I know that so many of us, myself included, have been so immersed in our own people that it's hard to get out of that and see the larger picture. But that's not true for everyone. And I think whatever we do is extremely, extremely important. I know my time is somewhat limited. I'd like to just show you the cover of my most recent book, because it tells a little bit of a story of a survivor and a problem he had in his vocational rehabilitation, unwittingly. That's the sub story. Ephraim, can you put that image on the screen, please? This is my magnum opus, the Handbook of Psychoanalytic Holocaust Studies, International Perspectives. It's about 26 chapters written by friends, colleagues, and prominent researchers in the Holocaust. All I can say is if I hadn't gotten the cooperation of the publisher before the lockdown and COVID, I don't think this book would have ever seen the light of day. But the cover is of great interest and importance to me. What it is welded cut nails in the shape of a cloud. It's about 3 inches thick and it's about 3 feet wide. And it's superimposed on a deportation list. And the deportation list is from Berlin to Sachsenhausen in September 1939, Erev Rosh Hashanah, right after the invasion of Poland. And on that deportation list is my father, Leo. You can see, if you look carefully, on the column on the left, about a little more than halfway down, just below one of the spikes, you can see Leo. And then there's Isaac and Jacob. Isaac was my grandfather. Jacob was my great-grandfather. The 3 of them were deported that day, taken by mass transportation, light rail to Sachsenhausen camp. One of the many experiences that my father had in slave labor was welding. He was involved in the construction of the massive works, IG Farben, Auschwitz III, Buna, the synthetic rubber plant. And part of his slave labor vocational training, quote unquote, was welding. When he came to this country, he was a welder. However, his memories of welding were just so horrendous. He couldn't weld, even though he had the skills. And the reason I mention this is that I think part of the adjustment that many survivors may have had is the associations they may have had with slave labor, how they were able to do things, but the memories were so bad that it might have inhibited them. So my father didn't weld until welding art became a thing, I guess in the 70s or early 80s. For a couple of years, he did a handful of art projects, and then he said, that's it, I can't do any more welding. So this tribute to him and other survivors is based on the work, the inhibition, the loss, the survival, the resilience, and all of the challenges that survivors have had, and all the successes and the offspring, as so many of us are today, and our children and grandchildren. So let me stop here. I think that this is an incredibly rich and compressed presentation, which already has gone over our period of time, but I see there's so much interest and a number of questions, and hopefully we can still have a short Q&A before people start to disappear from the screen. Here's one to Dalia. Your presentation is everything I wanted to hear, but I've heard a sadder experience and horror of hearing survivors described as sheep. Was there a national shame you've not addressed? I think this is an allusion to Hannah Arendt's sheep to the slaughter expression, which has been so searing and so painful.
Okay, this is certainly a very important point, and it is true that on the ideological level, not once, the expression of going sheep to the slaughter, כצאן לטבח, was mentioned. And it really depends in what occasions and how these things develop. And I think that we cannot ignore it. And I think what is really teaching us when we are observing the reality and its sophistication is that next to this derogative expression, we have the other parts of what is happening. And in the 60s, after the Eichmann trial, a period that I didn't go into it, this issue of going as sheep to the slaughter really came up in an open discussion, and the public appearance of survivors in the trial made an important change in many of the images. But if we only look at images like this, which were derogative and they were there, but not at all the activities of the survivors personally and as groups, as I mentioned before, the organizational power of them, the writings, the memorial book that they published, the centers that they built in synagogues, the memorials, the physical memorials in the landscape, and how they really created Yom HaShoah, the day of the Memorial Day for the Holocaust. I think we are getting into a very, shallow expression. So it is a complicated reality, and Israel was a complicated reality in the first day. Well, it's still a complicated reality.
It certainly is.
Too complicated. But
thank you for your Israeli perspective on that. I'll just add that in my local synagogue in Philadelphia, we'll be having a second generation educational program. And the title of that, tentative title of that program this fall will be From Shame to Pride, the legacy of intergenerational transmission. I think it addresses we will try to address exactly what you're saying about the life cycle experiences of second generation people and the transmission of shame and irrational guilt from our parents and from society and everything that was deposited and unwanted. And I think that leads into one of the other questions that Rachel has funneled to me about articles and books about transmission of trauma and resilience. I'll start with the book that I had mentioned in my comments, the handbook. We have a whole section on second generation issues of trauma and resilience. Robert Krell, a child survivor from Vancouver, has a chapter on resilience. Ilani Kogan from Israel, prominent psychoanalyst, has a chapter on intergenerational transmission. And she's written a very, very meaningful book, The Cry of Mute Children. Yolanda Gompel from Israel, who's written extensively on intergenerational transmission, uses the notion of the metaphor of radioactive fallout, how it's kind of in the background, it never quite leaves, and the accumulation of it can be quite toxic. So we have a chapter from Yolanda Gompel. A second generation poet, Janet Kirchheimer in New York, has a chapter on poetry. We have a section on creativity in there, including theater and film. And Janet has written very, very evocative and personal poetry, alluding to her second generation identity, which is really, it's very, very meaningful. So I think there is a lot. Also, for those people interested in intergenerational transmission from the German side, I have a prominent German colleague who has written about the intergenerational transmission of trauma and toxicity of a high-ranking Nazi and its impact on his daughter and the work that he has done with her, which is really parallel and different. So there's a lot in there. As I mentioned also, Heidi Feinberg's book, Telescoping of Generations, the classic Generations of the Holocaust, edited by Bergman and Jacoby in the early 80s, and Dina Wardy's book on memorial candles. Not sure if that's translated into English. I know some of her papers are. So there's again, this is just a smattering of things that are meaningful to me, and I think that if you find something that speaks to you, makes sense, read it and tell me about it. Tell us about it. There's also theories about genetic vulnerability. Rachel Yehuda's work on biological transmission, epigenetic stuff. For those of you who are interested in science and genetics, that's interesting. I'm not sure it furthers our psychological understanding, but I think it's a very, very compelling and important aspect to consider also.
We have a few more questions in the
Yes.
chat.
Yeah. What are the reasons for the American Jewish community's general lack of sympathy or interest in the survivors' experience? Again, my understanding, and I alluded to that briefly in my comments, that I think it has to do with shame. I think it has to do with a psychological wanting to distance oneself. You know, there's a certain psychological phenomenon that people have a tendency, no matter how enlightened they are, to blame the victim. You know, what did the woman do to bring on the rape? You know, that kind of thing. It's an Otis kind of bias that we see. What did Jews do to deserve this? You know, again, why didn't you get out? Why weren't you smarter? And why couldn't we do anything about it? So I think there's a certain distancing. As much as there was love and help and support, I think there was a lot of shame and guilt, unspoken guilt in the American Jewish community that we've been here already. You know, don't rock the boat. You look too Jewish, or whatever. The piece of the pie is not big enough. What other questions were there before?
But I think Beth wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah.
I just want to add that I think you have to take that in the context of the time. And this was a post-war period when a lot of, American men were returning from overseas, and they were focused on moving on. And that was the general sort of tone in the society. So I think that was filtered to the survivors. And also, if you think about it, I mentioned that the average age of the survivor was 29, and those were, people coming in, immigrants. The parallel group of the United States at the time were 29, were like first generation Americans, and they were not necessarily speaking Yiddish. They were, acculturating, even assimilating into American society. And they didn't necessarily want to be reminded of these newcomers that were foreign looking and Yiddish speaking. So I think some of that was at play in, the addition to the shame. I'm not sure about that aspect of the dynamics.
Beth asks, were all sponsors family members of the survivors, or could anyone who wished to be one become a sponsor?
Anyone could be a sponsor, didn't necessarily have to be a family member. And there were instances of people, even non-Jews. This was particularly true, interestingly, with orphans, people that wanted to adopt orphans. But as far as the adult survivors were concerned, the agencies like USNA had the ability to be sponsors, as well as family members and non-family members. So yeah, did not necessarily have to be a family member sponsored the immigrant.
And I think we have a lot of interesting comments. I hope people were taking a look at them, but I think that is the end of our questions for now. I think we'll probably have many more questions tonight as we think over all the things that we heard. I want to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished panel for sharing their invaluable insights into the challenges that face thousands of Holocaust survivors as they struggle to rebuild their lives after the war in the United States and Israel. And I think many of us have a lot of firsthand experience with that. Thank you to the program committee for your hard work in creating this program, and Ephraim Katzir for his outstanding technical assistance. And thanks to you, our very attentive and engaged audience, for joining and participating. If you're interested in becoming involved in any of the programs that Tina mentioned earlier, please contact us at generationafter@gmail.com. We would like to leave you a 1946 recording of Havedi Shalom Aleichem. It's sung by surviving Polish children in post-war France in a recording taken by the Latvian-American psychologist David Boder. It is incredibly touching. We thank you again. Be sure to mark your calendars for our November 7th Crystal Knot program. Thank you so much for joining us.
ילדים פולנים שבים פגרים בברזיל, שבים את השיר בבית שלום עליכם. Shalom, shalom, shalom Aleichem,